to newsagents.
Meanwhile, the call to national service has gone forth. The postman is delivering the handbook at your door, and perhaps you're standing there wondering what you can do. Well, if you're a young man, you can join the Air Force.
Darling, Soapy, we must say goodbye to Lewis.
Don't worry, my darling, he'll be back soon. He's doing his bit for the country, for king and country.
Why do you sound German?
Something like that. So the question is, why are we taking you back to newsreel times? Well, because it seems, deep breath, checks notes, that our Prime Minister has been forced to rule out the conscription of British civilians as the threat of a war with Russia rises.
There is a feeling in the armed forces that the threat level has increased to such an extent around the world, Middle East, Ukraine, China, that Britain is sleepwalking and complacent and not aware of the dangers that are out there. And some people are saying this is the 1930s all again, and maybe the first shots of the Third World War have already been fired, and it's time we shook ourselves out of that complacency and got ready for what might be coming. It's a scary prospect. Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Private Goodall.
And the reason I think that we are taking this so lightly and we are joking about it is because the alternative is kind of too difficult to think about. And I have to actually admit that I was sent this article about, the potential for conscription by a friend of mine. And I just went, oh my God, what are you reading? For goodness sake, stop it, put that down, it's ridiculous. And then sort of 24 hours later, I suddenly thought, oh, I understand where this came from now. I understand what they're saying. We should lay out no one at this point is talking about conscripting young British men and women to go and fight a war with Russia. But I think what they're doing, as you laid out, is just putting the fear of God into a society which actually has grown up really dependent on the peace in which we live. We've never thought of it as threatening us specifically.
Yeah, I mean, we are that blessed generation that have not had to go to war in the way that, my father, he did serve in the Second World War. And we have grown up in this sense that, yeah, there are threats out there, of course. But then, when my son was born in 1989, that was the peace dividend. That was the end of the Cold War. Western liberalism had won. We could turn swords into ploughshares. We could start building nice things instead of having an armaments manufacturing. And of course that has changed dramatically, and those changes that came after the fall of the Berlin Wall have been replaced by new, fresh uncertainties in all sorts of global arenas.
Yeah, and the reason that we're talking about this now is because the head of the army, General Sir Patrick Saunders, has started talking about the UK needing a military that can be expanded rapidly, but also what he's calling a citizens' army. He says that we need to have something that involves more private citizens working in a way that would fulfil a role that the army, quite frankly, can't now. On the one hand, of course he would say this. We've heard heads of the armed services years after years, decades after decades, warning about cuts to defence spending, cuts to personnel that leave us perilously exposed and vulnerable. And I suppose the reason it sort of touched a chord now is because it does feel really uncertain at the moment.
War feels closer.
War feels
It's
closer.
literally closer.
It's closer in this, but I think it's also closer in the sense that Russia has been fighting a war with Ukraine, and President Zelensky has warned us that actually, if Ukraine doesn't stop them, we're next.
Well, but I think, Emily, you allude to what, in a way, the General is suggesting why it's scary, is because basically, since the Second World War, since 1945, more or less, with the exception of the United States and Vietnam, certainly for the UK, war is something that has been done a bit like it was in the 19th century, or up to the First World War, which is it's been conducted by a professional army professional army, small army and navy, Britain's armed forces, and it's done over there. It's done far away. And war, it might affect politics, as it did over the Iraq War, for example. Sometimes it intrudes into kind of domestic politics, but it doesn't substantially. That has already changed with Ukraine because we've seen the effects of the energy price shock. But what the general is talking about here is the idea of it having a far more significant effect on the kind of domestic front and our politics, to the extent, I mean, the Telegraph push notification last night, I mean, sometimes you feel like, God, I just wish I could step back into the normal universe. The push notification was, Sunak forced to rule out army draft as Russia war threat rises. I mean, these are headlines these are movie headlines, right? Something that we've become accustomed to in recent years. But that sense that the geopolitical threat is rising in so many different arenas, even since the start of the year, has become more and more intense. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of that period, not before the Second World War, but before the First World War, where you've got an established military power, the United States, still a sort of world dominant superpower, but you've got rising sort of empires, rising countries around the world, and lots of theatres of conflict, and any one of them could just ignite the fuse gets lit, and you end up in a war which cascades around the world.
So that is the kind of broad macro picture, which you could take as the very pessimistic view, and then you would say, of course, the head of the army is absolutely right to warn of this, to make us, to raise our levels of consciousness about the danger, to talk about the fact that young people are needed and that they need to get weapons training. And there are all sorts of countries not at war who do that. I mean, if you travel at Switzerland on a Friday afternoon, it will be, people who have been conscripted going home with their guns, going home with their kit bag, back to their canton, wherever they are.
The French do service militaire, the Italians do it, the Spanish, I think, also do
Norwegians do it.
There you go.
My wife got out of it, but yes, they do it.
Yeah, so it's a common thing around Europe. We haven't had it in Britain at all. But I suppose the other way...
Well, we have had it in Britain.
Well, not for a very long time.
In the First World War.
Yes, but we also had national service until the early 1960s in the UK. But what we haven't had is that sense that everyone has got to get themselves ready or trained or whatever for 50, 60 years now. The other way of looking at it is, of course, different departments where there is government spending are always trying to defend their own budget by whatever means possible. And I suppose the cynic, the skeptic would say, is this just the kind of what we normally get from the head of the armed forces to say, we need more tanks, we need more ships, we need more men?
And women. Except, you look at where the numbers are, and we're predicted in 2 years' time to have 70,000 people. Now, 70,000 people's like...
In the army.
In the army. It's a village, right?
And the Navy...
It's a town.
And the Navy's, been reduced in size substantially. And we should say as well, though, I mean, I agree. I think we should have that sceptical lens on it, because military chiefs and the general is an outgoing military chief is going to be replaced. They're always arguing for more money, they're always arguing for more resources. Heaven knows their case is stronger now than it's been for many, many years, because we were told during the period of the War on Terror that these sorts of conventional wars between states, that was over. It was all about high tech. Boris Johnson famously told the House of Commons when he was Prime Minister, wars wouldn't be fought using tanks anymore. Well, my word, in the last 2 years or so have had all of our assumptions just been totally upended. But it isn't just the general, right? I mean, Grant Shapps himself, Defence Secretary, warned in a speech recently that the UK is moving from a post-war world to a pre-war world. This is language which has been echoed by NATO, among others. The Norwegians, the Swedes, NATO itself have all warned their populations that they could be at war with Russia within the next 5 years. And so there is a sort of drumbeat, a chorus, certainly around the West, of increasing fear of a resurgent Russia, which may yet win the war in Ukraine, and particularly if Trump is re-elected, suddenly other European theatres, in Eastern Europe in particular, look really vulnerable. That's what the general's talking about, and that's what these others, who are sort of augmenting and echoing what he said, are worried about too.
I mean, to your push notification for a moment, can you imagine Rishi Sunak sort of getting up on a Monday morning and going, oh, the polls are dreadful and the economy's really tanked and the Rwanda policy is not going anywhere,
And the general is saying you might have to reintroduce conscription.
We're going to conscript your sons, as the Prime Minister. It isn't the one line you want to hear. And I think that explains a little bit why they tried to shut down Sir Patrick Sanders. They didn't want him to make those points public. In fact, there has been a sort of ongoing narrative from the government that the heads of our armed forces haven't been allowed to be very vocal or outspoken with what is going on right now. And I think that also suggests a kind of fear, actually, on the part of the political class, that you don't want your generals to tell people what's going on.
I think that's a really interesting sideline to the central thrust of this story, is the control freakery in number 10 Downing Street over your military top brass being able to speak in on public platforms. And it was always the tradition that on Remembrance Sunday, the chief of the defence staff would do the rounds of the studios in his military finery to talk about the service, the sacrifice of so many of our brave men and women down the ages who've helped keep this country safe.
And to shake the tin a bit.
And to shake the tin a bit, quite right too. And wasn't allowed to this year. And you just think, what's all that about?
Well, and you add into that as well the fact that there was always tension. When Sunak was Chancellor, there was always tension between him, as there always is with the Chancellor to some extent, but I think there was particular suspicion around Sunak that he was, and he hasn't really acted on this as Prime Minister, but he was a bit sceptical of some of the armaments going to Ukraine, of spending on Ukraine, wondering what the end game was going to be. Obviously, he had a pretty tough set of fiscal approaches in terms of defence spending during the Conservative leadership campaign. It was Truss who was arguing for increasing military spending to 3% of GDP. Okay, you can say that, well, what was the plan to achieve that? But, that was a division line between them. And I think so that's all sort of part of the political dimension. I think probably like some people listening to some of those or news reports or listening to us now talking about war with Russia might be saying, well, hang on a minute, like if we end up in war with Russia, surely the idea of us all being conscripted into an army is by the by, because we're all just going to end up cowering in a nuclear bunker somewhere at best, because we're going to be at war, because that's always been the received wisdom, right? But during the Cold War and since 45, certainly since the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, that a hot war between the superpowers ends up in total annihilation. And that is sort of logical. There has been, though, this increasing fear that among strategists and people who think about military affairs, that there is a possibility that that is not the way that it turns out. That in fact you could have a hot war between nuclear powers, whether it's China and the United States in the South China Seas over Taiwan, or whether it's Russia and the United States over Eastern Europe, and you have two nuclear powers who do not choose to use nuclear technology, but they do choose to use all of the modern armaments, drone technology, cruise missiles, everything that comes with it that is at their disposal. And
look at Ukraine now. If you'd asked us 5 years ago whether we actually thought on the edge of Europe, and I know we've lived through the Bosnian War, we've lived through the breakup of Yugoslavia, we've lived through the Serbian conflict, all the rest of it, but actually here today now, when you look at, it's a bit like, the pictures are a bit like Stalingrad, right? It's kind of freezing conditions, man-to-man combat, taking soldiers. We saw the plane that was shot down yesterday, which purportedly had, Ukrainian prisoners of war on it, right? This is the stuff that doesn't look out of place in the 1940s at all.
No.
And you look at the casualties so far on the Russian side. We don't know the numbers on the Ukrainian side, and I'm sure they're every bit as horrendous. The Russians have already lost, in terms of men,
200,000.
Yeah, something like that. 3 times the size of the British Army. Yeah. And so when the general talks about you might need more troops, you can see where he's coming from. When the mincing machine that war has been in Ukraine has been so terrible in terms of loss of life.
And I would just say there is no chance. I mean, if there's one thing that we have learnt, really, since the Iraq War, maybe I guess you could go back to the Vietnam War, is that I think we do not have that dulce decorum est mindset anymore. No. We do not trust our politicians to take us into the right wars. And so actually this idea of being able to gather a civilian army, yes, of course, we had incredibly brave men and women who fought in Iraq, who fought in Afghanistan, who are deployed currently, and so that was their job, and they chose to sign up, and it was extraordinary. I do not think you will find an appetite for a civilian army, knowing what we know now about the way politicians have conducted wars in the last 20, 30 years.
But also, seriously, if they're serious about having a civilian army, what are they going to train with? What equipment are they going to use? This is the point. If you were really serious about doing that, then you would have to expand military capacity so much to enable. And I suppose that is the that is the point I would make with this, which is that look, I think the idea of any kind of conscription or massive expansion, civilian expansion of the army is far-fetched. I do think politicians, though, could be, and indeed should be, having a conversation with the British public, but European electorates more generally, about the idea of gearing more of our domestic production to rearmament. And that is the way that I would say this is a bit more like we...
Wait, so what are you saying?
So,
we should make more weapons?
Yes, we should be making more weapons, and we should be converting some of our industrial capacity to rearmament for two reasons. First of all, because Ukraine needs it, and the sort of backdrop to this is if Ukraine wins this, or at least can win it to such an extent that Putin is deterred because he's so militarily exhausted, then he just can't invade Eastern Europe because he's exhausted.
So who pays for that?
Well,
we
the
pay
British
for
government,
that,
yes. Yeah.
And we make weapons that we send to Ukraine.
That we then send to Ukraine.
Which is going to be domestically increasingly hard to get through. I think you look at what's happening in America. You look at what's happening with any future Trump administration. There is so little appetite now for expenditure on, dare we say, foreign wars.
But what I would always say is that this is the reason that if Russia wins this war, this is the reason why. It's because Russia has re-geared its economy towards a wartime footing. It's producing huge amounts of armaments, huge amounts of weapons, and funneling it to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running out of ammunition because we have not done the same thing.
Yeah, and we will
Europe
never know how many Russians are starving as a result of that.
Well, indeed. It's worth just underlining that Donald Trump, when COVID broke out, used the Defence Production Act, which is where you tell manufacturers what to produce. Yeah. And that was done for ventilators, for masks, for gowns, etc., etc. Yeah. And you have got that legislation in place in the US, where they say, right, you are going to stop producing whatever it is you produce that makes you a profit. You are now under contract
but that
to
was
produce...
to serve a domestic market and to save lives at home.
But those are the powers that are available if you want them to gear up for that sort of footing, which we haven't done. And what's happened is that you've got the big defence manufacturers who cannot produce the stuff fast enough at the moment, and that the store cupboards, the warehouses that are full of munitions are pretty much threadbare because of the amount of hardware that has gone to Ukraine to support them in their fight against Russia.
But in a way, the argument then that I think that certainly, let's leave America to one side, because if Trump comes back, all bets are off there. But
we'll be talking about him in just a minute.
We'll talk about him in just a minute. But Europe, in terms of Europe and what European politicians need to be saying to their populations, and maybe actually warnings like this from military figures help in this, which is to say, it would involve some domestic sacrifice to re-gear some domestic production towards armaments and rearming. But, my word, will that be a much lesser sacrifice than the prospect of fighting a hot war in Russia, which would involve things like civilian conscription against Russian imperialism? And that is the argument I think European politicians have got to make, because, frankly, the alternative, at the moment what we're doing is we are relying on Ukrainian bravery and Ukrainian sacrifice, and that can only go so far.
I'm going to call it and say that before the summer, or at least before the autumn, before any suggestion of a potential Trump administration hits America, there is going to be a settlement between Russia and Ukraine. And it's not going to be a settlement that anyone would have accepted 2 years ago when this broke out, but it will involve some kind of compromise being made for exactly all the reasons you're raising.
But I don't think Putin's going to do that this side of the election, because he's going to wait until see what happens with Trump, because if Trump gets back in, then he can get a better settlement than making it now. And Zelensky will make the same calculation.
I'm going to make a separate call. I think we're still some way off from seeing Lewis in his military fatigues, blancoing his belt, brassoing his buttons,
step down,
polishing his own face in his boots.
I'm going to be the
shining back at him.
I'm going to be the Vera Lynn of this war. It's my ambition.
We'll meet again. Well, look, let's get some political kind of insight into all of this and whether it is welcomed, the intervention from the head of the British Army. Let us speak now to Tobias Ellwood, the MP for Bournemouth and also former chair of the Defence Committee, who has served in the armed forces. Tobias, thanks for being with us. What do you think of this idea of a citizens' army for Britain to prepare for any conflict that might be coming?
Yeah, really interesting that the General Sir Patrick Saunders, his core message this week has actually perhaps triggered quite a emotive discussion about conscription, the standing army and so forth. His core message was look and understand at the deteriorating threat picture, which are we prepared for the gathering storms that are clearly forming around us. My view and his view and many others is no, we are not. And when the head of the British Army breaks ranks to say this while in office, rather than waiting for his memoirs, for us, we should absolutely listen to that. We may not be at war right now, but we're certainly not at peace, and war could easily find us. And Britain is exposed.
Tobias, I suppose the argument against that would be, yeah, I'm sure that, look, anyone looking at the world today can see that the threat levels are high on multiple fronts. I suppose the problem is that the head of the army saying we need more soldiers and we need more of this and we need more of that is something you hear year in, year out as they fight to defend their budgets.
Well, it's year in, year out, because many of us have been watching this for some time, because it's been a couple of decades that we've seen the West become increasingly risk averse, and we've seen authoritarian states grow in numbers, form alliances, and exploit our timidity. We're not willing to stand up for what we defend in, what we believe in anymore in the way that we did during the Cold War. We get spooked too easily. And the consequence of perhaps being complacent since the end of the Cold War, when we thought that all countries around the world would buy into globalization, to our international standards and values, including China, because of that, then we've depleted the size of our army, our air force, and our navy, to the point now where General Saunders and others are saying, absolutely, these forces are too small for what is coming over the horizon.
For all parents that are listening to the kind of arguments that are being had this week, and when they hear civilian army, they hear conscription, can you just clarify, are we absolutely never going to be talking about conscription amongst British civilians to be forced to join the army?
I'd like the idea, if we could persuade the nation, to introduce a form of national service, a year or less, duty to your nation, not necessarily joining the army, the air force, or the navy, but perhaps working with the ambulance service, the forestry commission, mountain rescue, the coast guard, somehow to instill a sense of patriotism, a sense of duty, encourage practical skills, fitness, which I think is important as well, provide a bond with the nation, develop those practical team life skills and so forth that perhaps you certainly could benefit from later on in your life. But to place into context, what General Saunders was talking about was a mindset, going back to where our world is going, that we all lean in and recognize that what is coming over the horizon and prepare ourselves. That means supply chains. That means also, yes, somehow increasing the size of our armed forces, our ability to provide greater resilience. And it's not just the state actors, it's non-state actors as well.
But wait a sec, you are ruling out conscription in terms of the armed forces, right?
Well, you can only introduce conscription and indeed even a citizen's armed force when, if the nation consents to do so. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work. Everybody would rebel. Right now, there doesn't feel like the threat. The fact is that this week has been the first time. I've been banging on about this for 2 or 3 years now, but really the penny does seem to be dropping that our world is going through into a very different era. There is something 1937 about the world right now, rising authoritarianism, new dangerous alliances forming, adversaries rearming, and these global institutions like the United Nations, they are now looking more and more like the League of Nations, and therefore, on the flip side, of course, you have non-state actors as well, and high tech, which you didn't have in 1937. All this together shows that we need to have a more cohesive Western response. And we don't have that right now. So what is Britain going to do about it?
Tobias, just explain to us then why, given everything you've said, why do we understand that Rishi Sunak didn't want to hear Sir Patrick Stevens making these remarks? What was he so scared of?
Well, it's very easy to perhaps spell something out and not take the nation with you. It's a massive jump, and perhaps the leap was too quick from General Saunders to explain the journey that perhaps the wider picture to place this into context. The idea that suddenly we're going to introduce conscription, perhaps imminently or in the next number of years, clearly is going to be too much. This is about recognizing this era of insecurity that we've had 3 decades where things have gone relatively well, relatively peaceful, but I'm afraid storms are gathering again. We may not want war, but we certainly haven't got peace anymore, and the trajectory is not going in the right direction.
But let's deal with a more prosaic problem. The armed forces cannot recruit at the moment. There are adverts on the TV and no one wants to join the army and the navy and the air force. And you look at, the navy recently mothballing a couple of vessels because they just don't have the crew.
You're absolutely right. When you look at the pay of what you get as a soldier, £18,000, you can easily earn that in Civvy Street doing something which doesn't involve, parade square. It doesn't involve getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And we need to address that. Otherwise, people will not join the armed forces. They're very highly trained, very professional, but their accommodation is absolutely improving. But pay has never been an issue, but it is an issue now. If I just make a plug, though, if we get this right, you will get more people, I think, signing up.
Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Tobias.
Thank you.
We were just talking about Donald Trump there and how the world changes, really, if he wins in November against Joe Biden, which is obviously, it's a two-horse race and is indeed possible. Donald Trump himself, it's sometimes easy to play for laughs over the most preposterous thing he has said recently, but he has to be taken seriously. And overnight, he has produced a video that has been uploaded, which is him talking about the future. He's not riffing. He is reading off auto cue. It is well produced. There are 2 or 3 different camera angles on him delivering the speech. And what it is, and I think we should play a bit of it, is him talking about what happens when he becomes president and the retribution, vengeance, call it what you will, that he's going to have on various government departments and various agencies that he holds responsible for his indictments, for his impeachments, and all the rest of it. Let's listen.
I plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption once and for all, and corruption it is. First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively. Second, we will clean out all of the corrupt actors in our national security and intelligence apparatus, and there are plenty of them. The departments and agencies that have been weaponized will be completely overhauled so that faceless bureaucrats will never again be able to target and persecute conservatives, Christians, or the left's political enemies, which they're doing now at a level that nobody can believe even possible. Third, we will totally reform FISA courts, which are so corrupt that the judges seemingly do not care when they are lied to in warrant applications. So many judges have seen so many applications that they know were wrong, or at least they must have known. They do nothing about it. They're lied to. Fourth, to expose the hoax.
Well, it goes on for another 6 points. I think there were 10 points in all in this video. When he's talking about FISA courts, he's talking about the courts that give you permission to eavesdrop on a person or people that has to be approved, and they are held, needless to say, in private, in secret, behind closed doors, because you can't announce to the world, I need to eavesdrop on person X. And of course, there was eavesdropping done on the Trump campaign because there were concerns about 1 or 2 of the people who were working with Trump in 2016 who had close links to Russia. But talking about this kind of, I'm going to remove rogue bureaucrats and I'm going to pursue that aggressively. I'm going to the corrupt elements of the deep state, I'm going to weed them out. I mean, it sounds to me that's a purge that is going to take place against the Justice Department, against the FBI, against the CIA, against all the agencies. And if you think about the first part of our podcast, all the agencies that are designed to keep America safe.
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering at this point that it's become quite fashionable amongst some people here on the right to big up a future Trump administration. 100%. It's just last week, I think, that Boris Johnson made the case in the Daily Mail for a new Trump presidency, saying it's just what the world needs. And there is a sort of sense of, hey, libs, we've got you. How are you going to like that? libtards or whatever the sort of, word of the day is. And it's really interesting when you break down what they are actually condoning there, which is something that sounds quite similar to a police state, frankly. And I remember being in 2016 at the Republican convention, where you had a whole floor chanting, "Lock her up, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up." It was like a drumbeat. It was like a sort of a savage, sort of room-filled drumbeat, talking about locking up the political opponent that he faced at the time, which was Hillary Clinton. And it wasn't just Trump; it was many of the Republican sort of cohorts around him, sort of senior figures around him. And then I interviewed James Comey, who you'll remember was the FBI director, who ended up being hated by both sort of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump for different reasons. But he actually told me that he woke up in the night wondering what Trump would do to him and his family, because he had been so vocally vindictive about what he intended to do as president. Now, I remember in that presidency, there were people who said, "Oh, you've got to take him seriously, but not literally." That was always the line, wasn't it? Take Trump seriously, but not literally, i.e. he spells out what he's going to do and then he doesn't do it. I don't think we know that anymore. I mean, I think we have seen enough of how he operates for even that to be quite up in the air, actually.
And he's evolved as a political figure.
He's
even
angry
since 2016. He's angry,
and he's got nothing to
furious,
lose.
and he's got nothing to lose. In fact, he's got everything to gain, right? Because if he doesn't win, he's probably in prison. And Emily, I think you're so right to bring up what Boris Johnson wrote, and other figures. Jacob Rees-Mogg has said it as well. Said he would vote for Trump. I mean, I am so fascinated by the extent to which political polarisation and the so-called culture war basically means that people end up putting on the kind of equivalent of kind of massive kind of headphones, where sort of noise cancelling headphones, where they just will not see or cannot see what is standing right in front of them. I mean, let's just listen to the guy. I mean, over the past few weeks, let alone everything else, just over the past few weeks, Trump has compared convicted January 6th insurrectionists to hostages, i.e., and we all know what contemporary resonance that has, the appalling sort of comparison being drawn with actual Americans who are still being held by Hamas. He's used fascist blood purity rhetoric, and I don't use that word ill-advisedly. It is fascist rhetoric, and he has once again refused to do exactly what, if we are to believe, Johnson has been a stalwart ally of Ukraine. Trump has refused again to commit to the NATO alliance. And now he's just done what we've just heard, which is basically commit to a kind of purge of the American state. Can we just, for once, listen to the guy? These things are not normal, and they should not be normalised.
Can I just compare this campaign in 2024 to 2016? Which I covered every day of that campaign. And travelling around with Trump, it was chaotic. They were making it up as they were going along. There was no structure in there. There was no organisation in there. And, I always thought Trump's best defence to the charges of Russian collusion was to say, are you kidding me? You're not organised enough to have collusion. God, if only we had that capability. Yeah. We don't. In 2024, actually, his campaign has been really disciplined, really well organised. The messaging has been tight. He has already chosen not to get involved in the debates when his ego would have drawn him to those debates. He's already fighting the general election. He's not fighting the primaries anymore. There is a real focus that was totally absent 8 years ago. So when you see a video like this that he has put out, that is clearly he is reading from auto cue, that has clearly been written down carefully, there is no riffing, there is no ad-libbing, he just delivers what's written on the text. Take it seriously.
And that was like the blood purity rhetoric. That was on the teleprompter.
Look,
it wasn't something he just said.
You have to, I guess, acknowledge that this is all stuff that he wants to do to wind up people like us, right? Literally, I mean, there is a sense of however cross, a podcast is getting, or a Democratic senator is getting, or somebody who believes in law and order is getting, then it is working in Trump's favour. So I guess the thing that we're trying to work out here is, and you know what his fans say, which is, I don't really mind about any of that. I think all the indictments are basically political, and I love Trump because he doesn't commit to foreign wars, right? So he think they will sort of portray Trump almost as the peacemaker, the guy who...
That's what Johnson was basically alluding to.
Exactly.
The idea.
You know, we're not going to spend money in Ukraine. We're going to spend money on US gas bills and, you know, household bills. That's all going to come home. So I guess the point is, who is Trump now appealing to with this rhetoric? Because he's got his MAGA lot, right? We know the MAGA lot are all behind him.
Or do you think he's just being himself? That this is just Trump unleashed, that this is just the point, again, going to your anger point, that he's just got to the point in his own story where this is just him being
I think
a purer version of himself.
I think it's a bit of wind up as well. I mean, I think it's a bit of like, you know, how cross are you going to be when you hear this, right? I can sort of hear Bannon. I can hear the voice of Bannon, who will sort of sit there chuckling into his, you know, sort of beard a bit. And there is something about all this which is just meant to be a massive wind-up for liberal-minded people.
Look, Steve Bannon, who was, you know, Trump's key election advisor in 2016 and went into the White House as the chief strategist after the victory in 16, although flamed out pretty quickly, is still there behind the scenes trying to pull strings. And
not still there, back there
and pulling strings. But I think that, look, there is a degree of wind up to it, but you can't ignore it either. And I think that's what we're trying to do, to say what is going on here. He's also, in 2016, if we're comparing to when he, you know, went into the White House, there were all sorts of people like Jim Mattis, who was a 4-star Marine general, and John Kelly and H.R. McMaster. And, you know, there were grown-ups and Gary Cohn and all the rest of them that were serious people who were saying, yeah, I know what you'd like to do, President, but I don't think we can do that. This time it's going to be entirely different, that the people he is going to bring into the White House are people who are fully signed up to what he wants to do. And waging this war on the FBI and the CIA and the Justice Department and anyone else who's caused him displeasure, I think he's pretty serious about it. But you're right to point out, let me just finish this point, but you're right to point out, who is he aiming for? Because at the moment, he does have a problem. That all he's got is MAGA. And the independents and the liberal Republicans and the white college educated women and all the people he had problems with in 2020 will listen to that and think, holy crap, I'm right to be worried.
And he's pushing them into Biden's lap.
Exactly.
Without Biden even having to get out of bed, right? I think the other thing is that we've slightly forgotten just how chaotic things were inside the administration. I always remember Michael Wolff, you know, the sort of journalist and author, saying that he got clearance to sit on a sofa inside the White House and nobody noticed him for about 6 weeks, and he just wrote the whole book because nobody actually kicked him out. The number of people, the personnel that Trump went through, right? The number of lawyers that everyone who he employed needed to get to help them. It was absolute chaos. So I don't, you know, when Trump talks about moving 100,000 people, you know, to places where patriots live, I don't know where those places are, but I'm assuming
Colorado.
he means sort of, no, I think he means like MAGA rich, sort of, you know, the state of Wyoming or Montana or Dakota or whatever. I don't know what he means, but I don't think he's going to have the organisational skills to get there.
Can't wait to see the Department of Health and Human Services move to Wyoming.
Yeah, I had to have a meeting with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was the comms director for Trump at one stage during the presidency. And I went into the West Wing to her office and sat down. And we talked about there was an issue that had come up where one of our cameramen had got attacked at a Trump rally. And I was saying, you know, you've just got to have proper security. If Trump's going to attack us, the media, at least make sure that where the media are standing, there is security. Yeah. And anyway, the conversation went on. She was very reasonable about it. I mean, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is now the governor of Arkansas and could be the vice presidential pick, and her name is in the frame. And I said,
it'd be a very clever pick, that.
Yeah, yeah, it would be. And I said, you know, how do you just cope with this level of sort of noise every day? She went, bourbon. And that's what, and she meant,
really?
and that's what she meant. She meant, wow. I drink a lot of bourbon. Yeah. And I think that is a real telling sign of what it was like being in that Trump White House.
You clung on with your fingernails, right?
Totally.
But to link back to our first conversation about geopolitics, this is why European leaders, and you kind of sense that it is happening more, but I think still not really reckoning with it, have to really start to have that conversations not only with themselves but with their populations about how frail European security might be if there were to be a Trump restoration, and what does Europe do?
This is why I think there's going to be a settlement. I mean, I feel awful. I feel like I've capitulated even saying that out loud. But I just think no one wants to see what Trump does with Putin. No one wants to see.
Yeah, I just think that Biden will hope that it doesn't come to that,
and so
Putin will wait and play it long to see if it does come to that.
We'll be back after the break.
There have been occasions on this podcast where our language has been maybe at times a little suboptimal.
Your language.
Well, our language is what I'm prepared to have. I think we've got collective responsibility. We stand together, all for one and one for all. Except it seems that there are others who've also got a bit of a potty mouth.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Is that
We
who we're
understand.
talking about?
We are specifically talking about the former First Minister of Scotland, who called Boris Johnson a clown.
Well, that's not too bad.
Not just a clown.
Oh.
She called him a clown. In a
Seems quite
what
tame.
the Times is calling a foul-mouthed outburst.
Foul-mouthed tirade.
A
normally.
tirade, yes,
Tirade.
exactly. And this all centres round how Boris Johnson handled the pandemic. And put in that context, I'm pretty sure he's been called worse than a clown by people even closer to him, some of whom probably worked for him. But anyway, Sturgeon, who we know has deleted her WhatsApp messages.
Weird that.
Yeah.
Very
Not the one
odd.
who managed to lose them.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
Amazing.
exactly. But that does not mean that the recipient of the messages deleted hers. And in this case,
old
it was
chestnut.
Liz Lloyd, her chief of staff. And those have now been disclosed by the COVID inquiry.
How worried would you be if your WhatsApps were disclosed in a public inquiry?
I'd be absolutely fine because
Because
They're
I can't
indecipherable.
spell.
Your
They're
messages are
indecipherable.
completely
They're all done with
indecipherable.
my left small finger.
Imagine some poor civil servant trying to sort of rake over the Maitlis message. What is she talking about
Yeah.
there?
Oh, it must all be fine, he'd say.
It must all be fine. It must be fine. She's
Yeah.
completely blameless.
We'll move on.
It is amazing, of course, that she has lost all her messages. Although, I mean, imagine like how much she swore. Imagine what she said when she found out about the caravan. I mean, honestly,
Well,
the
she
air
knew
will
about
have
the
been
caravan.
blue.
No, she knew about the caravan. To be
Oh,
fair.
yeah.
She didn't know about the forensic blue tent.
Oh yes, there is that. Yeah.
Different kinds of campaign.
Well, she will be at the COVID inquiry on Wednesday.
Oh, well,
So something to look forward to. You still with us on Wednesday, John?
no.
Oh, where are you going, John?
Goodbye. Time to go.
Do, 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 do.
Where do you think you are going, Mr.
Oh, calling me
Hitler?
Mr. Hitler.
No, I'm doing the BA theme tune now.
Oh, I think they've changed the BA theme
little
tune now.
hole.
You know what?
Tune.
This whole bloody show needs a public inquiry. I don't know about anything else.
No messages. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.